Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to today's EU Commission's Joint Research Network and RSA Europe webinar. My name is Daniela Karl. I'm the Deputy CEO at the Regional Studies Association and here on behalf of the RSA's European Foundation, RSA Europe. RSA Europe facilitates knowledge exchange and capacity building and serves the regional studies and regional science, academic, policy and practice communities in Europe. More on RSA Europe can be found via the link that my colleague Nicola will share in a second in the chat box. Today's webinar is the second in a series of 3 webinars focusing on the Future of Cities report. The previous webinar in the series focused on EU cities and heat extremes. The recording is available on the RSA Europe website. The third and final webinar in this series will be held on the 20th of June and will focus on inclusive cities, fit for crisis and long-term challenges. As with any of the webinars in this series, these are freely available and open to join for anyone. You don't need to be a member of the RSA, and the recordings will be added to the website after the webinars. My colleague Nicola will also share the link to the forthcoming webinar in the chat. Some housekeeping for today's webinar. This webinar is recorded and will be made available on the RSA Europe website. Please put any questions you might have in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. If your question is intended for a specific person, please add their name to the question so the chair knows who to address the question to. Feel free to say hello in the chat box and from where in the world you're joining us today. That's always nice to read. In the first part of today's webinar, we have a policy introduction followed by a presentation on the policy brief. And then after this, there is time for 1 or 2 clarification questions. So in case you have a question that needs clarification, please add this to the chat box. And after the first 2 presentations, we will have time to answer these. Okay, but without further ado, I shall introduce the first speaker, which is my pleasure to introduce, Aris Alvanos, who's the seconded national expert and member of the homelessness team in DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion of the European Commission. Aris, the floor is yours for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniela, for this invitation and opportunity to talk to this webinar, which is on homelessness. And it's also part of a very interesting series of seminars concerning the cities, the challenges that cities face. We think also on behalf of the European Commission that the cities are actually better placed to address all these challenges, among which is homelessness. We'd also like to welcome the policy brief produced by the Joint Research Center, which is on homelessness, a very insightful, very comprehensive policy brief, which addresses the issue of homelessness and touches upon some really important aspects and dimensions on homelessness, like the hidden homelessness, the need for better data on homelessness, and also the need to address this issue with effective policies. When discussing homelessness in the EU, we come across one of the major challenges we come across is this lack of common legal and statistical definition among member states, but also within member states. This lack of this common definition of homelessness leads consequently to different monitoring and counting methodologies. And thus, the data produced are quite divergent among member states. This is one of the initial remarks and one of the major challenges when we try to discuss and approach homelessness in the European Union. So it's difficult to assess the extent of the phenomenon mainly in comparative terms. That means that we don't have reliable, but more importantly, comparable data between member states, so as to assess the extent of the homelessness issue at EU level. There are, of course, some really important, of course, a really important work done by FEANTSA, by the 8th annual overview of homelessness in the European Union pointed out that almost 900,000 people are homeless. More recently, the work done by OECD through the data country notes on homelessness also point that a number really close to that one. So we estimate that roughly 1 million people are homeless in the European Union, and this is a number that we can, the nearest we can come to. Another element which is coming from these estimates, this efforts to assess the extent, to quantify the data, to quantify the phenomenon, is the rising tendencies across the member states of the European Union, with a few exceptions. Now, the framework within which, the strategic framework within which the EU level action takes place is of course, the European Pillar of Social Rights, which was adopted in 2017. It is the compass that leads the EU efforts towards social fairness and inclusion. And consequently, in 2021, we had the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan. Now, the pillar consists of 20 principles. Principle 19 is the one related to homelessness and housing exclusion. It calls for, as you can see on the slide, access to social housing or housing assistance of good quality for those in need. Secondly, the right to appropriate assistance and protection against forced eviction. And thirdly, adequate shelter and services for social inclusion of homeless people. So these three elements are those who define our course towards addressing homelessness and housing exclusion. Delivering on principle 19, we have the European Platform on Combating Homelessness. It was launched by the Lisbon Declaration, which was signed in June 2021. This platform is essentially a framework of cooperation, of coordination, of debate, of exchanging good practices and leading our efforts, our concerted efforts towards addressing homelessness. Members of this platform are national governments, European institutions, civil society, social partners, and of course cities. So we are talking about a multi-level, multi-stakeholder community. We like to call it a community of practice. And since its conception and its operationalization, the platform has become a reference initiative and the focal point for the battle against homelessness in the EU. Now, the goals of the Lisbon Declaration, which launched the platform, are, you can see those really concretely in this slide, is that no one sleeps rough. That means sleeping in open spaces, that no one lives in emergency or transitional accommodation longer than is required, that no one is discharged, and this is also a really important aspect, what we call deinstitutionalization, is discharged from any institution like prison, hospital, or care facility without an offer of appropriate housing. The element of evictions, that evictions should be prevented. This is also the aspect of prevention, which is also really important when we're talking about homelessness. And finally, the element of non-discrimination based on the homelessness status. What's also really really important concerning the European Platform on Combating Homelessness is this housing first policy approach that we try to promote and disseminate among member states. This is an integrated housing first policy approach which combines, as we said before, the element of prevention based on the evidence that if we can prevent people from being homeless, then we can avoid all the trauma involved in this homelessness situation. And then, of course, the core element of the housing first approach is stable housing solutions combined with support services, what we call the accompanying services, which have a social and economic aspect as well. So the goal, the target of this housing first approach, which we promote through the platform, is to help homeless people maintain their tenancy, achieve stable living conditions, which are really important for them to be self-empowered and pursue different paths away from homelessness, and of course avoid falling back into the state of exclusion, poverty, and what other elements of exclusion exist in this domain of homelessness. The platform is the work of the platform takes place under the work program, which was adopted in 2022. It covers a 2-year period from 2022 to 2024. So that means it ends this year. This work program outlines the governance structure of the platform, its activities, and its deliverables. The activities of the platform take place under 3 concrete work strands. The first one is what is really related to our webinar. It's the strengthening of evidence and data on homelessness. The second strand is the mutual learning component, which entails mutual learning activities in order to instigate debate, the exchange of knowledge, and the exchange of best practices among member states, with the goal of supporting member states to design and implement national strategies, national action plans to combat homelessness. And last but not least, the access to finance work strand, which we'll see later on. Now, going to each of these work strands. The first work strand, as we always said, it's about monitoring and data collection. The overall objective is to strengthen the analytical work and data collection to promote evidence-based policies. This is really important in order to conceptualize what's the extent of the problem and design evidence-based solutions. 3 main activities are being forwarded under this work strand. The first one is the pilot project on the European homelessness count, which will take place in 35 cities from 20 member states. The second one is the policy toolkit on homelessness and a monitoring framework, both drafted by the OECD and supported by the European Commission. And the third one is the EU Silk ad hoc module on housing difficulties, which is run by Eurostat. I've chosen to go into one of those, each of these projects more deeply. The European Homelessness Count is a 2-year pilot project funded by the European Commission, and it's led by the University of Leuven. The aims of this project, which is funded by the European Union, is first to identify a common operational definition and collection methodology in order to have like a common concept, a common framework of identifying and measuring homelessness across different European member states, which is a challenge itself. And secondly, testing this methodology at city level in different member states. As I already said, this project is going to take place in 35 cities from 20 member states. So we have a really good coverage across the European Union. The project is about organizing and coordinating one common simultaneous homelessness point-in-time count, and it entails both street count and administrative data from different sources, and also the participation of the social sector, services that actually engage with homeless people. The count will collect data on numbers, but also characteristics of homeless people. So it's going to be, we envisage to be a count that will provide us with very valuable data on the profile of the homeless people. It's going to cover the ethos light categories 1 to 3, but optionally, there's also the option for cities to opt for categories 4 and 6, essentially covering the whole of the ethos light typology. As already said, it's street counts and data from administration and services. What's really important also about this project is it's the engagement and ownership also by local authorities. Local authorities are going to be really engaged in this project. They're going to push forward. They're going to raise awareness in local societies about homelessness, which is also an added value of this project. The core of this project is a learning network of cities, which meets regularly and exchanges on the methodology and different challenges faced by the project. And currently, the project is in the stage of shaping this common methodology we talked about. And we estimate, according to the schedule, the counts are supposed to happen in October or late October or early November. The next project I already talked about is the OECD Policy Toolkit and Monitoring Framework. The Policy Toolkit is a tool to provide evidence-based guidance to improve the measurement of and policy responses to homelessness. Then a monitoring framework which will present common approaches to collect data on homelessness and will identify their key characteristics, their strengths, limitations, and common implementations challenges. It's essentially a mapping of different common or different approaches concerning the measurement of homelessness in different member states. And lastly, the recently published country notes on homelessness data, which provides information on statistical definitions of homelessness, available data collection methods, and national strategies. I have a link, there will be a link in the chat box on this. Finally, the EU Silk ad hoc module. It's an ad hoc module which consists of different variables on well-being, material deprivation, and housing difficulties. The section on housing difficulties looks at also the experience of persons having housing difficulties in the past during their lifetime, and it examines the experience of housing difficulties from duration, perspective, reason, and also the factors leading to its exit. It was run in late 2023, and results are going to be published in the second half of 2024. Going to the second work strand, the mutual learning work strand, the overall objective here is to support mutual learning of good practices for combating homelessness. As we already said, the platform is a forum of debate, of exchange of knowledge, and a ground to discuss different practices, different solutions across member states and cities, and also to explore further the implementation of these successful existing models. Up until now, there have been 6 mutual learning events organized by the European Commission. The main element is the knowledge sharing and exchange of best practices in different key elements of this integrated person-centered and housing-led approach we want to promote through the platform. Further on, the mutual learning activities are going to be evolved, are going to be designed and implemented by the Epoch Practice project, which is led by FEANTSA and which is funded by an action grant by the European Commission. And lastly, in this strand, we have the Social Innovation Call. It's a call of proposals funded by the EASI strand of ESF, and its purpose is to fund pilot projects which address homelessness, and even more importantly, they help to build the capacity of stakeholders that are engaged in the battle against homelessness. Last, but certainly not least, is the work strand on access to finance, which with an overall objective of promoting the use of EU funding. There are multiple funding sources, funding mechanism provided by the EU. It's the SF Plus, the ERDF, the InvestEU, and they can, of course, each one of these has its own modalities, but they can certainly fund and support solutions to combat homelessness. In the context of this working group, this work strand, a working group on access to finance has been set up. It's co-chaired by the Council of Europe Development Bank, a multilateral financial institution with a social mandate and experience in promoting and supporting projects that address homelessness. It brings together representatives from central governments, local authorities, as well as NGOs, and it has three specific components. The first one is to discuss a strategic approach to optimize the use of finance. When you use the term finance, we refer to both repayable and non-repayable forms of financing. So we're talking about combining, blending EU funding, the potential of blending the EU funding with other sources of funding. Secondly, mapping of public and private funding resources from homelessness. And lastly, the work on a potential pipeline of projects which promote this housing-led, housing-first approach, and that could combine public and private financing institutions. I'll leave it to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'm ready to answer to any questions or.
Yes, there will be time at the end. Thank you, Aris, for the policy introduction, and it's great to see so many joining this session from all over Europe, really. Please feel free to share any links to your organization or any projects you work on, because this webinar is also an opportunity to network, of course. Our second speaker is Paola Proietti, who's a scientific project officer in the Unit of Territorial Development, Fair and Sustainable Economy in the Directorate of the Joint Research Center. Her recent work relates to inequality, extreme poverty in Europe, local monitoring of the SDGs and development finance. She's an expert for the JRC Task Force on Equality. Paola will present on the policy brief. Paola, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniela. I hope you hear me fine. So today my presentation aims at presenting you some of the key findings of the policy brief, indeed, so that they can be further elaborated on together with some of the co-authors of the policy brief, who will take part of the roundtable that will follow this presentation. Why did the JRC decided to work on this topic? Actually, as the JRC, for those of you who don't know it yet, is the in-house knowledge service of the European Commission. And in this capacity, as Unit of Territorial Development, we have been working on the principle of leaving no one behind since some years now, as it is the central and transformative promise of the 2030 agenda. We have also been working on specific phenomena and vulnerable groups in the past, as you can see from my slide, from migrant integration to the detection and upgrade of informal settlements, the accessibility to urban amenities from senior citizens, child poverty, and since 2022, we also have been working on homelessness. But what about this specific policy brief? Actually, as all the other policy briefs connected with the Future of Cities publication, it is really a short document, but aiming at providing key attention points, both for stakeholders already involved with homelessness, so to continue discussing together on some way forward, and in this case on the monitoring of homelessness, and also in doing so in an international viewpoint. So in this specific policy brief, we talk about the monitoring of homelessness because despite an increased commitment in recent years, which is undeniable, we believe that long-term initiatives and dedicated resources are still very much in need, because we are still quite far from reaching the target of zero homelessness. as demonstrated by the recent estimates from Abbé Pierre Foundation and FEANTSA, which mentioned that in 2023, there were still around 895,000 people living as homeless. And this, together with the other estimations that we can observe in the literature and in policy documents, are still likely to be underestimations. Why so? Because within countries, within Europe, many countries are now finally aligning to the ethos definition in order to talk about homelessness, and also to the use of ethos-light framework in order to monitor it. But besides this, the coverage of the living conditions included in the ethos-light framework really differ across countries. There are countries like Sweden, which cover all of them when measuring homelessness, while there are countries like Italy, for example, which cover only a couple of those. For example, the number 1 and 2 and the number 2 and 3 are the one most covered in monitoring efforts. But it's also true that across countries covering the same living condition, for example, people living in accommodation for the homeless, there are some countries which have a wide coverage of accommodation type. So, for example, they also include the number of people, asylum seekers and refugees hosted in reception centers, while other countries that do not do the same. But there are other reasons, let's say, linked with the underestimation of homeless individuals, which are linked with the geographical coverage of the assessments and also the type of measurements. Why so? Because, of course, there are countries which only perform the monitoring at the national level or only at the local level, while, of course, a combination of the two types of assessment is more informative. And also because across the different measurement types, of course, we see that there are advantages and disadvantages which each monitoring method. The point-in-time counts is a method which is mostly used at the local level. For example, it was used in Paris, Rome, Milan, and Madrid. And it implies the counting and surveying of peoples living rows and or in shelters in a single point in time. This method has the disadvantage, for example, of requiring a huge number of people in order to run this assessment, and is also a method which usually underestimates short-term homelessness. The time location sampling is a method which is used the most at the national level, and it implies the census of facilities used by the people experiencing homelessness, followed by a survey of a random sample of users. And this method, for example, has the disadvantage of not being able to capture people living rows. And then there is the capture and recapture as another methodology to monitor the stock of homeless people in a certain moment in time, and also which allows, let's say, the monitoring through administrative data, and which has the disadvantage, for example, of not being able to capture all those people that are not part of, do not enter administrative data, like it is the case, for example, of undocumented migrants. Of course, all these methods can be combined, and this helps reducing a bit the disadvantages of each one of them. But let's say the main consequence of underestimation is the fact that some groups are left behind. And in this case, the most vulnerable in a group which is already vulnerable. So according to the literature and according to estimates, the group that are more frequently underestimated are the one of undocumented migrants, as mentioned before, but also of LGBTQI individuals, of family experiencing homelessness, and of homeless people living in smaller centers, together with women and youth. These two groups are the ones that we deal with in the policy brief. And how is homelessness, let's say, across women? Why is homelessness across women underestimated? According to the recent 2023 OECD questionnaire on affordable and social housing, because of three main reasons. Because women tend to rely more on informal support to find accommodation. Women experiencing living roles make serious effort to conceal their gender and location for reasons linked with safety. And also women in shelters for victims of domestic violence are not included in the count in more than half of OECD countries. More or less the same reasons are the same that caused the underestimation of young individuals living as homeless, because as you can see from my slide, there are different profiles of young people most affected by homelessness, but the common characteristics is that they also rely on informal network of support. They tend to live with family or friends, couch surfing, for example, like LGBTQI plus individuals, according to the literature. And they also prefer to refer to youth hostels more than night shelters or emergency accommodation. Of course, the consequences in terms of deterioration of the well-being of this population group are even more long-term than for other groups. And that's why Eurocities, which was analyzing youth homelessness together with the 29 cities in 15 European countries, suggest in the policy brief a number of strategies in order to alleviate youth homelessness. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to go through all of them, but one on which I would like to point the attention is the improvement of housing access, which is even more difficult for young individuals, as we can imagine. But of course, according to the latest Eurobarometer, it is a point of concern for many population groups. So pathways for continued improvement are also proposed in the policy brief and were elaborated by UN Habitat, also in collaboration with FEANTSA. And among the most relevant one, we could mention the fact that the human right-based approach should always preferred, because of course homeless should be considered as right holders. And their access to welfare policies, as well as to voting, for example, should be always allowed in a non-discriminatory way as for other population groups. And we will discuss this more in detail with Arianna Gatta, which is the academic involved also in the policy brief. And then a second pathway for continued improvement is, of course, to upscale what has proven to work. First of all, the housing first model, which is of course, a practice according to which permanent housing is offered for individuals with complex needs as a priority, regardless of their history. There is a very interesting website for those of you who don't know it yet, which is the one of Housing First Europe Hub, which provides many information, webinar trainings, and also research works on the topic. And let's say other pathways for continued improvement include integrated and personalized services, which should be combined with better access to housing. The fact that it should be necessary to continue to perform longitudinal and impact analysis to understand what works and where, and how was it implemented to work, which is also quite crucial. Other important points are to break the stereotype, because, for example, there is the idea that homeless people do not work, while the number of working homeless has been increasing a lot in Europe, even if not like in the US, where the University of Chicago found that the 53% of people living in shelters was working homeless, and the 40% of those living rows, which is quite impressive. Also important is to recognize and keep in mind the intersectionality of homeless. We have been focusing on youth and women, but of course the intersectionality is crucial. It's crucial to avoid the misuse of data, to continue fostering the capacity building among public personnel and promote participation of people with lived experience. And finally, of course, support policy measure with adequate funding. And this is also something which will be discussed in the roundtable. So for those of you who are interested to know a bit more, you can find the policy brief freely available on the European Commission website, which is mentioned in my slide. In the slide, there is also the list of authors who participated in the brief, and I would like to take this occasion to thank them all. And finally, for those of you interested in other pieces of research on homelessness, we just released last week a paper where we propose new urban metrics for inequality, which are able to account also for the geography of homeless individuals. And we would be curious to also receive your comments if you find the time to have a look at it. So I now conclude my intervention and leave the floor back to Daniela. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Paola. As we are slightly running late, I suggest we do the questions later on at the end. So if you have additional questions, we already have a couple. If there are more questions, just put them in the Q&A box, and Luis will work through them in his part. Speaking of which, the second part of the webinar will be moderated by Dijkstra. Luis leads the Urban and Territorial Analysis team in the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission. This team produces and analyzes territorial data, builds spatial scenarios, supports impact assessments, and makes policy recommendations for city, towns, and rural areas in Europe as well as Africa. Luis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniela. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm very happy to moderate. Also, to help us catch up with time, I will not waste it by waffling and pass the floor directly to Alexandre Lloyd, who works for the OECD. I'm also going to keep the introductions to these speakers very brief and just pass the floor to them. Alexandre, over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you as well for the invite to speak today. My contribution focused on women, so I thought, or women experiencing homelessness. So I thought it would be good to first start with our data on homelessness country notes that we recently released at the OECD. So for those who aren't aware, we've released 41 OECD and EU countries homelessness country notes, which include statistical definitions on homelessness, some national data as well. And of course, we include, where possible, the disaggregated share of women experiencing homelessness, which the homelessness notes were just linked in the chat, and the indicator, which I will just talk about in a second as well. But in this indicator, you will find a chart on the share of women experiencing homelessness across OECD and EU countries. And what you find is that, as was mentioned previously, that the share varies quite widely across countries, from over 50% in countries like England and New Zealand to between 5 and 15% in countries like Mexico, Japan, and Colombia, and European countries are in the middle, but there is still quite a big variation among EU countries. Of course, there's some explanations to why that there's such high variations, and some of this is the methodologies that exist in the statistical definitions. So that is something we focus on quite a bit in the indicator. In terms of statistical definitions, we found that a higher or a wider statistical definitions tends to lead to a higher reported share of women experiencing homelessness in national statistics. So this would include, for example, people sleeping rough, people in temporary accommodation, but then also other categories like people staying with family and friends. And other definitions that are a bit more narrow, which, for example, only include people sleeping rough or people staying in temporary accommodation, tend to report a slightly lower share of women experiencing homelessness. Another methodological difference has to do with collection methods. So we find that, for example, a census, which does a little bit of a better job of capturing a very large range of experiences of homelessness, tends to enumerate a higher share of women experiencing homelessness than some other methods, such as a street count or a service-based method, for example. We also look a little bit at the specific methodology. And as was previously mentioned, roughly 60% of OECD and EU countries do not include temporary accommodation for victims of domestic violence, while 40% do. But we do find that countries, as one would expect, we do find that countries that do include these forms of temporary accommodation to enumerate a higher share of women experiencing homelessness in national statistics. Maybe on the more practical side, I can discuss an example. So for some of you may already be aware, but in London, there is a women's census or a women's street count, which complements the London street count, which is, I think, an interesting example of different ways to modify collection methods to account for the different experiences of women who are experiencing homelessness. And so practically, they've modified the counts to be during the day, and they go to various services like libraries, coffee shops, and other places where women experiencing homelessness might congregate to try and account for the fact that women experiencing homelessness tend to be less visible when sleeping rough, and also especially at night. Before I pass off to the next speaker, I should just quickly mention two key OECD outputs that we're going to be releasing soon. The first is a monitoring framework, which brings together different collection methods across OECD countries, so roughly 6 of them, and it discusses some strengths, some weaknesses, some opportunities to improve them, and we're planning on including some conversations on how to combine methods as efficiently as possible. And we also have our policy toolkits, which we've been working very hard on, coming out soon, later this year, or beginning of next year, which focuses on policies to address homelessness, well, to address or prevent homelessness, and to help countries with designing better national strategies. So thank you very much. I look forward to answering any questions should you have any, and I will pass on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandre. Thank you also for sticking so closely to the time. I suggest we take questions at the end, and I now would like to pass the floor to Solene Molard, who works for Eurocities. Welcome, Solene. And I've got a question for you. Eurocities really emphasizes the role of local actors in addressing homelessness. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit more how this multi-level governance of homelessness has evolved in the recent years, and what are the emerging challenges, especially for local governments. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for giving us the opportunity to present some of our work. So the elements that I'm going to talk about come from our report on youth homelessness at local level. It's important to note that all of our data come from cities. So of course it's representing part of the picture and from the knowledge that cities have. What we really noticed is that over the last few years in our work, cities really share that there is a huge increase of homelessness, particularly among young people, that they saw that this was worsening with the different crises, particularly the housing crisis and also the migration reception crisis. And so there is a fear that this will continue, and this prompted some of our research and work on this topic. It exacerbates existing challenges and also means that certain groups that were maybe not affected so much by homelessness are also incredibly, increasingly affected, like students, families, women, as we were talking about. And what we see is that cities are trying to catch up and increase their response to these situations. Both from the prevention perspective, particularly, for example, working on eviction prevention, but often not really with targeted measures on youth homelessness specifically. And a lot of the more targeted responses are response once the person is homeless or really very at risk of homelessness. And for that, they have mix of services from very low threshold support to higher support need. And in our research, what we did is we had a look a bit at the key factors that lead young people to become homeless, and how the cities try to respond to those. So to mention very quickly, things like substance misuse as a form of self-medication, often for mental health issues. And so we see here the importance of working in cross-cutting areas. And that's where, for example, the multi-level governance, the multi-stakeholder elements are really important. To mention a very quick example, in Lisbon, you have like outreach teams that are composed of social workers from the cities with therapists, which is often less a local competency. And that is really important. Another element that we see a lot in youth homelessness is the role of family breakdown, isolation, and the skills that young people need to live independently. And here, it's really important to look at young people who are exiting care, And some cities like Glasgow have established what they call corporate parenting, which is basically that the city has the responsibility for the young person as long as the person needs it. The same way a parent doesn't lose the responsibility for their child once the person turns 18. But I really want to insist on the role of income and affordable housing, and the lack of affordable housing, where a lot of young people that might not be perceived as vulnerable are also getting in really tricky situation. And Paola was mentioning earlier, homeless people who are working. I think this raises really big question around the fact that even when you are working, you might not be able to have a house. So that is a really important element. And the responses to all of these factors can come to a big extent from cities, because they have big competencies on homelessness, working on prevention, encouraging collaboration, for example, with housing services, with mental health services, and also mainstreaming the focus on homelessness into different policies. We also see the importance of having some targeted measures for youth specifically and groups more at risk. And that's where it's particularly important to take into account the hidden forms of homelessness, because a lot of young people might not be the typical rough sleeper that are visible in the street, but rely on less visible forms of homelessness. But it's also a very strong need for investment in social and affordable housing, because a lot of the very ambitious long-term measures that we need to respond to the needs, such as Housing First for Youth, that providing flats, will not be possible in the middle of a very big housing crisis. And we also see that there is a reduction of the share that governments are putting, so the national spending going to cities are slightly reducing. And similarly, yes, of course, the access to EU fund is also essential. And finally, just to mention that some elements that play a role, like migration, are not necessarily big local competencies. So that's why it's really important to keep working together. And I think the platform on homelessness has a key role to play here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Solene. So now we pass to Queensland. We have Arianna Gatta with us from the University of Queensland, and she has done a study looking at monitoring frameworks for homelessness. And she also looked at the accessibility of different welfare policies for homelessness. So Arianna, could I ask you to elaborate a little bit on this study of yours? Thank you very much.
Monitoring and monitoring homelessness is very challenging. And this means, for example, the estimates have to compare over time and across countries. But the problem, and it is not limited to a statistical curiosity, the problem is that it is also hard to monitor whether existing welfare policies reach the homeless and are capable then of lifting them out of poverty, essentially. And not only National Bureau of Statistics are unable to reach the homeless, but importantly also the public administration. And it has pointed out, I have conducted indeed a study on this in Italy, and in particular in Rome, where I estimated the take-up of various welfare policies among the homeless population. And yeah, I mean, this required indeed, first of all, establishing, sampling this population, and then indeed, through a survey, figuring out who's accessing what. The first problem in accessing welfare was the requirement of being registered as a resident in the registry office. That for a homeless person that does not have a permanent address, this was really problematic. And I would like to take the opportunity of this webinar to raise that this was a problem in particular for nationals of other EU member states. So the access to residence was really different. So it was a much lower for this specific target, even lower than for non-EU citizens. the reason, I mean, for mobile EU citizens, it was necessary to show either a work contract or sufficient means to be able to be validly registered, and then essentially invisible to the public administration. And my understanding, this is the result. So I have been interviewing also local policy officers, and the result of this was European laws that restrict the possibility of registering in other member states, only for those that can demonstrate essentially to have a job or sufficient means. This means that currently what is allowed in the EU is free movement of labor and workers, and not of people as such. And I think this is problematic from an ethical perspective. It should be addressed more closely by European institutions. Some of these people have often worked in the informal sector, exploited for years in other European countries, and following an illness or accident in the workplace end up in extreme poverty and with no protection and no access even to minimum income schemes. And at times, in some other European countries, I know that this then applying for welfare in such circumstances can lead even to deportation to in some European states. That's not the case for Italy, but where the problem lays ahead. So I believe that if we really want to foster a European citizenship, we really need to be addressing these issues. So thinking of the goals of the Lisbon Declaration mentioned before, that no one should no one's living rough. Well, if access even to social housing is also dependent on this kind of rules, then it's hard to see how the problem could be solved if also the legal principle underpinning the free movement of people within the EU are not addressed. Besides this, so the fact that of course, also other elements affecting access to welfare, they are related more with policy design instead. So in particular, income support measures often are so tightly targeted, and the documentation required to prove eligibility is so massive that it becomes very hard for someone who is experiencing homelessness.
Arianna, could I ask you to wrap up?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So, and essentially, in this study, we have observed that very targeted measures are a lot harder to access, even for people that live in extreme poverty, compared to, for example, COVID-19 relief. COVID-19 relief that was purposefully made easy to access was a lot more accessible for homeless people as well. So, and with this, I want to close just to say that it is possible to design benefits that are accessible for people. COVID demonstrated that. And with this final talk, I'll leave the floor to the next speakers and look forward to more questions.
Thank you, Arianna. There will be some questions in the question box as well. Now I propose we move to FEANTSA with Freek Spinnewijn. And I want to ask you a question about something that you've developed together with the Y Foundation, established the Housing First Europe Hub to advance the understanding and support to scaling of Housing First. So how has Housing First evolved or should evolve to address the changing nature of homelessness? Freek, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Louis, and I can see from your face that you're stressed for time, so I'll be very, very quick. So I will not waste time on the Housing First Europe Hub. The link has been shared in the chat. People can go there. It's a very interesting and dynamic learning and training platform, and please engage if you're interested. But 2 words on Housing First, and I will not be able to do justice in 4 minutes to the potential of Housing First. But let me just say that what it is it puts basically the traditional approach to addressing homelessness upside down. Instead of seeing housing as the result of a long integration process, often long integration process in the shelter system, it uses housing as a lever, as the start of an integration process. So that's basically what it is. It's a bit of a revolution, you could say, in the homeless sector, but with huge potential. we have to remind ourselves that it is relatively new in most EU member states. We're speaking about Housing First for at least 15 or maybe even 20 years, but it has been gradually picked up in the different member states only recently in the last 5 to 10 years. And also important to say is that it works. The starkest indicator of its effectiveness is that most of the people in Housing First retain the housing. That was what people were most skeptical about, but substantially more than 80% of the people in Housing First retain housing. There's other indicators of success related to well-being and other softer indicators. I'm not going to detail, but it seems that the success goes beyond the housing retention rate. You asked me about the challenges. Very quickly, 4 challenges. The first challenge is to bring it to scale. We hear a lot about Housing First. Most EU member states are talking about it, but it's often words and not action yet. Or when it is action, it's more experiments than actual policy. If you look at the number of beds in shelter, we think it's at least 600,000 beds in shelter and growing. If you look at the number of beds in Housing First, we are at a fraction of that. So we're nowhere near a tipping point in the European Union. So bringing it to scale is the biggest challenge, probably. The other challenge we shouldn't underestimate is to secure political support for Housing First over the longer time. Because in a lot of countries, Housing First is being implemented in a context of growing homelessness. And that is a challenge for policymakers to justify that in to the electorate, for instance, but not only the electorate. So how do we create a positive and supportive environment to secure political buy-in, sustained political buy-in in Housing First? The third challenge is that we want Housing First to be transformative of the way homelessness is addressed, rather than something that we add on to what exists already. That's really important. There's only a few countries that use the transformative potential of Housing First at the moment. And the fourth challenge that I see, and the last challenge, is that we have to gradually find the courage to enlarge the target group of Housing First while sticking to its basic principles. For the moment, we focus, or most countries focus on people that are long-term homeless, because long-term homelessness or chronicity of homelessness is a proxy of the complexity of their needs. And what we want is to focus on people with complex needs. But in quite a number of European countries, complexity and chronicity are not strictly directly related. I mean, there might be people that have short-term experience of homelessness, but still have complex needs, and also they should be targeted with Housing First. And then I think there is experiments, Solene already mentioned it, Housing First for youth, Housing First for women fleeing domestic violence, etc. We should see if we can also push that forward and bring it to scale. And the last word I want to say, if you allow me, is that because of all these challenges, I think an EU dynamic with relation to housing, in relation to homelessness, which favors, which pushes, which promotes Housing First, as Aris has said in the beginning, is extremely important. It helps countries, not only policymakers, but also service providers, to hook on to a progressive dynamic. And I think that's why the EPOC, the European Platform for Combating Homelessness, is so important and has so much potential. Thank you. I hope I stayed within the time.
Freek, you did a fantastic job. While you're here, could I also ask you to answer one of the questions from the chat? Do you prefer homeless or unhoused, or other terms for?
As a term, yeah, I saw the question. It was a question from a researcher, I think, what terms are used in research. I mean, there is many different terms being used: sheltered homeless, unsheltered homeless, unhoused, people experiencing homelessness, etc., etc. But what I can say is that in most of the research that I see these days, ethos, the European typology of homelessness and housing exclusion that has been developed by FEANTSA, is used as a reference framework definition, a reference definition, a framework definition to be precise about what part of homelessness people are talking about. So my answer is maybe not fully satisfying, but ethos is, I mean, what I want to say is, like, it's useful to use ethos to be more precise, more clear about what aspect of homelessness you're actually writing, researching about.
Okay, well, that's great. Thank you, Freek. Well, I hope you all enjoyed it. I definitely did. Our time, unfortunately, is up. So I'd like to thank everybody for the presentations, for participating in the panel, for listening to us. And with that, wish you all a very good day. And I also want to let you know that there will be a recording available on the RSA website. So thanks to all. Have a fantastic day, and I hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.